almost every major significant movement for democratic expansion of democracy, for civil rights, human rights in general, and I think health reform, whatever it may be, and I think that's probably going to continue. If the labor movement is disoriented, suppressed, marginalized, atomized, as has been happening since the Thatcher years, I think that does not bode well for the chances of significant developments. You can see it right now in the United States, in fact. There's been a major attack on democracy, on rights, and so on, and on labor, and breaking it down. On the other hand, right at the moment, we're getting the first major popular uprising, and a significant one, against the process of moving towards a kind of corporate tyranny, and it's labor-based. It's based on, it's a reaction to attacks on the unions, the remaining ones, to try to take away their collective bargaining rights. And that's led to a significant popular uprising, surprising in fact.
My next question is, you have mentioned Gramsci's work before, and the way you describe intellectual culture in the West is similar to his own analysis of intellectuals. Is he still worth reading today? And do you think his work offers valuable insights?
I think he's worth reading. He's an important thinker. Like most commentators, I don't exclude myself, you can pretty well figure it out for yourself. I mean, he says there are things that are said well, they're suggestive, provocative, worth thinking through. But if there's anything profound, I've missed it.
Since the 1940s or the 50s, you've had to take position publicly on hundreds, if not thousands of issues. Are there any that you regret or that you feel you took the wrong decisions on?
Oh, yeah. Usually because I didn't do enough. So, for example, I mean, I was very heavily involved in the Indochina War, involved in resistance, facing long jail sentence and so on, but it was much too late. I mean, I didn't become seriously involved till the early 60s. At that point, the United States had already invaded South Vietnam and was practically destroying it. In the 10 years before, 1950s, the client government that the U.S. installed after it dismantled the peace agreements probably killed 60 or 70,000 people, and it was so violent it instigated resistance. But during that period, there was unfortunately no protest, including me, just some talk about it, but nothing more. And there are many other cases like that. There's a lot more that should be done.
I want to ask you about the Middle East. On the one hand, we have Egypt and Tunisia, and on the other, we have what's going on now in Libya. What is your reading of the situation in Libya?
Well, Libya is quite different from all the other countries in the region. Libya is the one place where there was a very violent state reaction repressing the popular uprisings. Actually, Libya is not the only place. The other place, which isn't talked about very much, is Western Sahara. The current wave of uprisings, I mean, there have been many in the past, but the current wave actually began in Western Sahara in November, just right a couple of weeks before the Tunisia uprising. There was a nonviolent protest of Sahrawis, the indigenous people, against the quite brutal and illegal Moroccan invasion. Morocco invaded Western Sahara, was subject to decolonization under the UN auspices, and Morocco, in violation of Security Council, other resolutions, invaded, occupied the country, and transported a lot of people in, which is illegal, and has run a very repressive and brutal regime, and has rejected every effort at negotiation and settlement. And in November, that happened again. And this time, the Moroccan forces came in, crushed the uprising. It was harsh enough so that it did come to the United Nations, which theoretically is responsible for what happens there. It's a supposedly UN administered territory for decolonization. There were initiatives to have at least an inquiry, but France, it's the main protector of Morocco, intervened and blocked it. So nothing happened, and it was barely reported. But Libya was, the reaction was far too extreme to avoid, and besides, the West is anti-Gaddafi anyway, so it was an easy, it was easy to become outraged at what indeed was and remains outrageous, the violent repression of the uprising. So it's different than the other cases. On the other hand, if if the uprising spread to Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't be surprised to see the same thing. That's, in fact, the U.S. and its allies have already shifted their rhetorical positions. In the case of Egypt and Tunisia, they didn't like the popular uprising overthrowing dictators that they had strongly supported, but they could sort of tolerate it as long as there was no significant regime change, and there really hasn't been. But if you get to Saudi Arabia, it's quite different. I mean, that's the jewel in the crown. That's where most of the oil is. And any serious move towards democratization there would be pretty harshly resisted by the U.S. and its allies.
My final question to you, Professor Chomsky, is about Palestine. In particular, I wanted to know what your opinion was on the Palestine papers recently leaked to the press, and also your broader view of Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what you think will happen there in the future.
The Palestinian papers, they didn't give us a lot of new information, some, but not a lot. But what they revealed is a very weak position of the Palestinian negotiators. I mean, they have, I don't blame them for this, they simply are in a weak position. And that showed in the offers that they were making. At the same time, it showed the total arrogance and contempt of the Israeli negotiators, who assume, and on the basis of the distribution of power in the region, it's understandable, they assume they can get what they want. And it also showed the contempt of the United States. The statements by Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton were dismissive of the Palestinians, were pretty ugly. So it showed something about the attitudes of the participants, which is not a great surprise, but unfortunately it's pretty realistic. As for the prospects, I think the options are not being described accurately by those who have Palestinian interests at heart, either the Palestinians themselves or the solidarity groups. The way it's almost always discussed is that there are two options. Either there'll be a two-state settlement along the lines of the overwhelming international consensus, or else, as Palestinian leaders have said, we'll give Israel the keys. They can take over the whole territory, and there'll be an anti-apartheid struggle on the South African model. Israeli leaders have said the same thing. Those who are in favor of some sort of partial settlement said, well, if we don't do it, we'll face this terrible demographic problem. There'll be a huge Arab population in what we want to be a Jewish state. However, those are not the two options. There's a third option, which is a much more significant one. The third option is exactly what's happening. The U.S. and Israel, working together, are instituting a form of control and domination, which is neither a two-state settlement nor taking over the whole territory, which Israel doesn't want. They've created a framework. It grows out of old plans, going back to the Alon plan, took another form under the Sharon plan, and Olmert had his own version. But basically, Israel takes everything to the west of the annexation wall, it's misleadingly called separation wall. It includes arable land, control over a lot of the water resources, the pleasant suburbs of the major cities in Israel, linked to them by superhighways and so on. Take over the Jordan Valley, from which Palestinians are by now pretty much excluded, and drive salients through the country. There are several breaking up the rest into pretty much unviable cantons. That way Israel will take over about half the territory and integrate it into Israel. They have huge infrastructure projects for Israelis and visitors only, not for local people. So you can drive quite easily from Ma'ale Adumim, halfway into the West Bank to Tel Aviv, let's say, and not even seeing an Arab. You wouldn't know there is one, maybe some man up on a hill leading a goat or something like that. But and the remaining Arab population will they may have an economically sustainable existence, and in fact in Ramallah the elites may live pretty well, on foreign money and so on. But theaters, concerts, sort of a Western-style life. But a neo-colonial arrangement with no prospects for any form of independent development. And the rest will drift away. And as far as Israel's concerned, that's fine. They don't want them. So there won't be a demographic problem. Too many Arabs in a Jewish state, and there won't be two states. That's the ongoing option. And there isn't going to be any handing over the keys. Israel's not going to take them. Meanwhile, Gaza will be kept separate from the West Bank. That's in violation of international agreements, but Israel and the U.S. have been dedicated since 1991, actually, to separate Gaza from the West Bank. By now, it's a very sharp separation. Gaza will just stay an open-air prison, as it's often called.
Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you very much for speaking to Ceasefire.